I'd like to welcome Mr. Bill Lucy to our labor history studies and to acknowledge from the very threshold his extraordinary leadership. And I'm so appreciative, Mr. Lucy, for your meeting with us on Zoom today. Thank you and welcome to our studies of labor history.
Well, thank you very much, Doctor. I really appreciate being asked to be a part of this.
It's a pleasure. And as everybody knows, I'm Dr. John Lavin, and I need to just acknowledge at first the background and the leadership. Mr. Bill Lucy, originally from Memphis, Tennessee, is an American Trade Labor Union leader, and he served as the Secretary Treasurer of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees from 1972 until 2010. I'm welcoming him to our class, and I've shared with Mr. Lucy our purpose to identify those principles of human rights underlying the justice initiatives of the labor movement of the United States and globally. And I want to premise our remarks on the fact that we've begun with a reading of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech in 1961 in Miami, Florida, to the national leadership of the AFL-CIO, those union leaders who were assembled there, and Dr. King's emphasis in his speech to them, December 11th, 1961, that human dignity and people's needs are the premise of the rights that get written into law, and that certainly the unions had created the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act of 35, and Dr. King emphasized that was an achievement. He went on to say, rights aren't just words in laws. They need to be realized in people's experience and lives. And so that's a historical fact that we need to deepen our attention and appreciation of. 7 years later, of course, Dr. King was in Memphis, Tennessee, and putting himself out there, taking the enormous risks of advocating for workers who'd lived and struggled with poverty and inequality. And that's a very important story to us. So I wanted to begin by talking to Mr. Bill Lucy. This is a rare opportunity, and asking him, Bill, or Mr. Lucy, can you tell us about your parents, about your family, and where you were raised and educated, and your background?
My folks are from Alabama. They're from a town so small that the welcome to town and you are now leaving signs almost back to back. But I grew up in the early years in Memphis, Tennessee. My folks, my father left on the outset of World War II and moved to California to work in the shipbuilding industry.
Wow.
My mother left a few months later, and I followed dinner and I went along with her, and actually grew up in California. I went to elementary school, began in Memphis, but finished schooling in Richmond, California. Did a stint at a place called Contra Costa County. Spent a little bit of time at University of California, and I took free speech seriously, so they put an end to that. But essentially, my growing up days was done in California, in the Bay Area, just north of San Francisco. I became involved in labor as a county employee in 1953, and began to learn a little bit about the value of trade unionism and the role that trade unions really play in the life of working people. Sort of learned about the union's responsibility to its membership, but also the membership's responsibility to the union itself. And as you pointed out, Dr. King really had the incredible recognition of being a civil rights advocate, a human rights advocate. But aside from that, he was a great, great advocate of the trade union movement and the role that it played in our society and should play in our lives. and incredibly important was how he saw the labor and labor's role. You mentioned the Wagner Act. Dr. King recognized the incredible value of legislation that gave workers' rights, but he recognized the incredible difference in the lives of the spectrum of workers. Low wage, low wealth workers were at the bottom of that legislative advocate. Pardon me. At the bottom of the legislative role. Well-paid workers were at the top, and the workers who were worse off fell into the category of people he was trying to help.
Certainly. To that end, can you tell us about the racial climate of those times?
Well, in the 50s, of course, in California, we didn't have the difficulty that workers had across the South and in other parts of the country where they were low-wage workers and dead-end jobs and poorly paying jobs with lower benefits, because workers in those categories, while they had the legislative right to organize, their ability to benefit from building a union was very limited. When we get to Memphis, I'll sort of speak a little bit more to that. So Dr. King was trying to make the labor movement more relevant to the aspirations of low-wage workers in the most difficult jobs. And his speech that I drew a lot from was the one given to the AFL-CIO in 1961, where he made the point that labor and religion was two of the most powerful institutions in our society. Yet they didn't seem to come together around each of their basic responsibilities. The civil rights movement, the human rights movement, was working to give workers rights, but without labor as a partner in that relationship, workers could not realize anything, any benefits from those rights. So he was saying to labor that we have common goals, we have common interests, and we ought to be working together to improve the lot of working people. But he made the observation that neither had worked fully on behalf of that membership, and they had not worked together. And his advocacy was to work together to improve the lot of workers across the spectrum.
Do you think that, I know Dr. King in his letter from the Birmingham City Jail says that, by inference, he says there are a lot of people who would prefer me to simply stay in my church.
Right,
and,
right.
But he chose to move outside the, I think he says it so beautifully, move outside the reflections of stained glass windows into the raw light of day and into the world where people struggle. Do you think that that was a crucial piece of connecting labor with religion?
Dr. King early on recognized that the inability of workers to raise themselves out of desperate situations. I mean, if you worked every day, but still didn't earn enough to raise yourself out of poverty, then you needed some other instrument, and he saw organized labor as that instrument. I mean, the history of organized labor had been such that it had created the middle class, or at least movement towards the middle class. It was beneficial to skilled workers, but for low wage, low skill, unskilled workers, unless you had a strong trade union movement, their ability to enjoy the fruits of a potential middle class life were limited. And he began to think about that and think about how you brought these two forces together. The human rights, civil rights, religious community together with organized labor to benefit all workers. And you saw him from the Birmingham jail and the observations that he was making begin to move towards economic justice, economic rights, and how to build a movement that could begin to support the movement of those rights towards workers who were at the low end of the economic scale.
As he took those risks of facing down a systemic racism, were there people who stood with him in labor?
Absolutely, absolutely. Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers was a strong ally. Many of the industrial unions supported his efforts to help build a stronger trade union movement, and at the same time bring low wage, and at this time primarily African-American workers into the trade union movement. But in those days, it was so tied. It was so tied to the struggle for workers' rights, and they were not as engaged in the major unions at that time, like the Steel Workers Union, where you had rampant discrimination in the plants, and the building and construction trade unions, where you had Black workers, but not workers who were in a line to enjoy the fruits of being a part of those unions. And so you had very progressive trade union leadership who saw his message as meaningful, but they had real difficulties trying to move that kind of agenda within their unions.
What would you say attracted the labor movement to Dr. King?
I think on the progressive trade union side, there were many unions who believed in equality. They just, I mean, their perception of their role was wages, hours, and working conditions, which did not include some of the issues relating to civil rights and human rights. And there were trade unions who were, I guess, traditional unions who didn't see that as a part of their basic function and responsibility.
Were they able to reach out and to bridge that set of expectations and to connect with people?
Not across the entire trade union movement. There were unions who had high numbers of particularly African-American members who saw this as a part of their basic rights and responsibilities. And as I mentioned, the United Auto Workers, the Steel Workers, public sector unions, they saw it because it was a factor in their building the stronger and broader membership.
So he was a great organizer.
Absolutely, absolutely, and demonstrated by his actions his support for organized labor. I mean, he was a spokesman for organized labor long before strikes and organizing activities started. Everybody calls him a great civil rights leader, but there was then a very strong reluctance to recognize him as a trade union leader. In Atlanta, he supported any number of organizing efforts by low-wage workers to gain a better life.
I think that it's important for students, for people in our time, to understand what that meant for African-American workers at that time.
Well, in the 50s, mid-50s and the early 60s, wages for what we would call essential workers, but not workers who are skilled trades, et cetera, were incredibly low. I mean, a minimum wage was a decent wage, but it was at the bottom of the barrel. And Dr. King recognized, along with a lot of other civil rights leaders, that there needed to be some vehicle to give them a voice in the process that determined their wages and benefits. And organized labor was certainly the instrument to do that.
What were the risks that workers had to take in order to assert their rights?
Well, workers who were not in the skilled trades, workers who were not in the strong manufacturing industry and not good paying jobs in those industries, the risk of organizing was the risk of losing a job, the risk of being put upon by the unilateral powers of the employer. The employers really had no strong commitment to fairness in the workplace. I mean, their mission in life then, as it is now, was to increase, the balance sheet, the profit at the expense of paying decent wages and decent working conditions. And Dr. King recognized all of these as part and parcel of the same problem, where people worked 8 hours a day, still could not raise themselves out of poverty.
And on an emotional level, Dr. King's presence was inspirational. To what extent did he anticipate the emotions, and what were the feelings people, particularly African-American people in the Black church, in the workforce that you described, who felt limited options?
Well, I think Dr. King could see it every day in the communities that surrounded him, that he lived in and taught in and preached in. These were people who were hardworking people, yet they didn't enjoy the benefits of a decent salary or decent working conditions. And he saw these as part of his struggle to improve the quality of life through the establishment of strong civil rights legislation, fairness in the workplace. And he took this burden on, but made the connection that a lot of other leaders did not make, that organized labor was the vehicle to try and achieve the changes that these communities need.
What do you think unions learned from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference?
Well, I think they learned not only mobilization techniques, but the fact that the goals and the mission were as beneficial to trade union members as they were to people who were not union members. I mean, Dr. King believed that, as we believe now, that numbers make a difference. And that if the trade union movement expanded its membership, that its basic job of improving wages, hours, and conditions of employment would create a better and stronger society. He believed that to his core.
And that came to crisis, perhaps what Dr. King would have called a moment of creative tension,
Dr. King was clear that we were only going to change the social structure by asking people of goodwill to confront the issues that were on the table. And he recognized that nonviolence and to confront the power structure and power that existed with a simple request for respect and dignity and a nonviolent struggle would not, on his face, bring these into being. So his struggle for voting rights, his struggle for, as we're saying, workers' rights, were a part of that overall effort. And he was just totally committed to a nonviolent struggle, but he thought that mass mobilization was a part and parcel of how you make these changes.
So April 1968, what was on the table?
Well, if you recall, Dr. King had really confronted the nation as a whole with the conditions of people who just were living in poverty across the country. But the poor people didn't have a face. And Dr. King set out to mobilize what he called the Poor People's Campaign, to bring the face of poverty, not just Black poverty, but poverty as a national issue, to the attention of the policymakers. And he began to talk about the problems of the poor, whether it's Appalachia or the Deep South or the North, for that matter. And the common denominator among all of these people is that they didn't have decent jobs that paid decent wages and opportunities for advancement. So he decided he would bring the face of poverty to Washington, D.C. so that the legislative leadership could see it. And he began to talk about that. And the uniqueness of the Memphis, Tennessee sanitation strike was that these were the exact people that Dr. King was talking about, people who worked every single day, but still did not earn enough to raise themselves out of poverty. And the day-to-day difficulties and the economics was such that the harder they worked, the poorer they got. And his thing was to bring enough people here to have them on the mall in downtown Washington, D.C., so that people could see the conditions under which they lived.
Yeah, as a witness to those events, how did that affect you?
Well, oddly enough, I was on the staff of the National Union at that time, and with a national responsibility. And so I could see it clearly, the conditions that he described, whether you were in Detroit or New York, in certain areas of the city or the state, whether you were in Pennsylvania or whether you were in New Jersey. Poor people tend to be able to be seen in their conditions. And Dr. King simply said that we would bring people from all over the country, whether it's the indigenous population from Montana and Dakotas to poor whites from Appalachia. It was all part and parcel of the same problem, not having decent jobs, not earning decent pay, and not having conditions of employment that allowed them to move out of poverty into a meaningful lifestyle. And he saw this as central to organized labor's role and to the role of the civil and human rights community.
So crucial. And how would that affect you and your sense of leadership in time to come from those?
While there had been a number of strikes, there was no strike like the Memphis 1968 sanitation strike that embodied all of these issues. The great strikes of the industrial unions development and others were essentially economic strikes. The Memphis sanitation strike was not an economic strike. It was a strike about respect and dignity and the rights to have a voice on those issues that were being determined for you by someone else, but affected how you lived and your responsibilities for carrying out your job. These were workers who had worked the better part of their adult life, and they were still making $6 and $7 a day. In many cases, below certainly below the poverty level. But these were people who worked every single day, yet they had no vehicle that spoke about their interests to their employer to make a request for changes in conditions, changes in benefits, or the improvement in how you did the work. And it was not the union who set out to organize these workers, it was the workers themselves out of their frustration with not being able to change their conditions that led to this incredible strike. And like I said, the strike was not about a quarter more an hour. It was about respect and dignity for those workers who performed those dreadful jobs.
So defining. And how would you say that organized labor benefited from the sacrifice that Dr. King made there?
I think in time, the recognition that the issues that he was focusing on were the key issues in the life of the American labor movement.
Yes.
The legislative process really forced us to look at just salary or just the economics of it. But we know that you can make the highest salary possible and still have the worst working conditions possible. And so his notion was that people need to have a way to argue for the processes that would give them a decent way of life, all of which are salary, working conditions, respect, dignity, fair treatment, and not the arbitrary activities of someone who held the power to dictate how you lived.
What do you feel can be learned today in retrospect from the devoted efforts of those sanitation workers in Memphis in 1968?
Well, I think workers really want respect and want to be treated with decency and fairness. They want a level playing field. None of them are asking for anything that don't exist already for a substantial slice of the American citizenry. They're simply saying, give us a voice in the process that determines how we live. We want to be in the room when you're making decisions about our well-being. We want to have the right to speak to those questions. And I think that's what struck me, not only about Dr. King's work, but also about what organized labor can and should be doing. I think the Wagner Act was passed way back when. I think we've got to take a whole new look at whether or not it defines the nature of our responsibility. We sort of boil it down to wages, hours, and conditions of employment as the three basic responsibilities of organized labor. Well, we're saying now that it may well be that we got to figure out how to add social justice and the pursuit of human rights to our responsibility as an instrument of social justice. How do we put those into contractual relationships with our employers? In as much as the two tremendous forces in our society, the economic force that deals with how capital responds to its workforce, the human forces that ought to exist as a part of this. I mean, organized labor in representing its membership must represent them in all the ways that their employment can suppress their hopes and aspirations. Do we seek to negotiate on social justice questions?
Do you feel that that's so crucial? Do you feel that your experience at an international level, I mean, we've talked about the struggles of folks on a local and a national level, your experience coordinating international efforts affects your perspective on what is needed today? And
well, absolutely. You know, we've simply got to look at and understand the experiments with democracy. I mean, Lech Walesa in Poland saw the trade union movement as a vehicle for democracy. The argument there was not about a quarter more an hour. It was about how do we fully enjoy the fruits of a democracy given the totalitarian situation we live in. So he saw the trade union movement as a vehicle. If we look at South Africa as an example, we would still have apartheid if workers and civil movements and social justice movement had not come together to say that we want a voice in the rules and procedures and processes that govern our nation. So COSATU and the mine workers union, all of those were instruments of improving democracy. And the economics will follow it if democracy exists.
in our time, given those struggles here in the United States and in other nations, when we think about folks migrating,
I apologize.
no problem, migrating, immigrating from one country to another, coming here, what is the human rights issue in your perspective?
Well, you know, if the corporate community or the capitalist model treated working people with fairness, you wouldn't have movements all over the globe. I mean, people are moving around the globe trying to find a way to earn a better life. And it's not immigration that's the problem, it's migration. I mean, people are chasing a better life. Those who have the power to use capital as a manipulative force simply decide we want as much as we can get for as little as we have to pay for. So you have this incredible difference in the lifestyle of working people. It doesn't matter what nationality or ethnic group you came from. the forces that are at work are forces that deny you the opportunity to find a better living where you are. If you could do that, you wouldn't have to go anyplace else. I think the message there is we need institutions that can, I don't want to use the word force, but convince other institutions to treat their societies fairly. And you won't have people leaving one nation to go to another. So the lesson I think I learned is how do we make and bring the powers that exist to think in the context of improving the lives of people where they live and where they exist as corporate entities to create a better life. In the end, you will find people, nobody wants to leave Nicaragua and go anywhere if they can find a decent life in Nicaragua.
Absolutely.
Or wherever.
Yes. And you're speaking here on the authority of experience, which leads me to ask you, over the many years that you demonstrated leadership as a union leader with people's needs at task always, what sustained you spiritually? What gave you the inspiration to continue the struggle, the negotiation, the advocacy?
Well, the clear vision that no matter how many you have helped, there's some more that needs to be helped. Mm-hmm. And if the trade union model is a vehicle for improving the quality of life, it should strengthen itself so that it can help as many as possible. And at the heart of this movement it's not, like I keep saying, the nickel more an hour. It is the social change that can be brought about if the minds and hearts and spirits of people are brought to understand that if we use these vehicles, we can improve the quality of life for just untold numbers of people.
Yes, and based on that wisdom, what advice do you have for people entering the workforce today, as workers seeking to organize, as folks who will be involved in leadership in companies, in government? What advice would you offer them?
I think for those who have the power to affect the lives and the quality of lives of people around them, they need to recognize that they are instruments. And as Dr. King put it, I mean, they're instruments of fairness, and whatever their careers are, it's not like I've got mine, but my job is now to keep you from getting yours. I mean, that's sort of the backwards trend that seems to exist all over. Yet, the technological changes that we're seeing, the investment in a number of areas, we can make that all beneficial to peoples of the world. I mean, there's no real reason for the incredible poverty that exists. Now, I mean, we live on this island of plenty surrounded by a sea of poverty. Why? There was a fellow by the name of Michael Harrington some years ago wrote this book called The Other America. And he sort of detailed the vast difference between those who have and those who need. And yet the ability to make all of these equal exists. And I think that's the role of a vibrant trade union movement, to really make the movement an instrument of change.
Well, that is a profound wisdom and advice that should sustain another generation. So, Mr. BillLucy, I would like to thank you for being with us today, the 5th of October, the year 2020, a year of change and challenge. And I know that your reflections and your insights will make an enormous difference in the intensity and depth with which our students understand the connection between labor and civil rights. So thank you.